We're going to be looking at Chapter 2 now, and really the main point of Chapter 2 is to get introduced to Visual Studio 2015. We were just looking at the VDI and the VPN and how to connect to that environment just in case you get into the situation where you can't get this installed on your own equipment. I do even get students that actually prefer to work on the VDI exclusively, but truly, when you're working with a piece of software like Visual Studio, the best thing to do is really to have it installed on your equipment. So hopefully you guys had success doing that installation and download. If you do run into any sort of a problem and need a little bit of help or advice, please do not hesitate to contact me. I think the installation procedures for Visual Studio 2015 and 2017 as an auxiliary or alternate product are both pretty simple these days. I mean, you will discover, especially if you're at home, it takes a long time to download and install. The procedure, I think conservatively you can plan on about an hour's worth of time to do the whole process. Depending on the different options that you're going to choose when you do the install, it might take significantly longer. The most basic version of the installation will be adequate for all the work that you're going to do in this class. Because really we're using one of the core languages inside of Visual Studio, and that is one called Visual Basic, which you see at the top of the slide here. The version that Microsoft is currently on with Visual Studio is Visual Studio 2017. It just came out about a month or so ago. And from the feedback I've heard from people out in the field and on the couple of machines where I've installed it, it's a pretty smooth process, and I don't really see any significant differences between Visual Studio 2015 and 2017. So if you opted to install 2017, I think you will be fine for just about everything that we're going to do. If we find any problems, I'm sure you'll point them out to me. So either 2015 or 2017, if you have an older version already on your machine, some students do, and that might be either the version 2013, which is very similar to 2015, or 2012. 2012 is a little bit different, but with all of them, you can do any of this work that we see in this book. None of it is that far off. If you have 2013, you might just opt to just stick with that and save yourself the hassle of downloading a new version. Unless you have some time on your hand, that's completely up to you. If you're using the VDI, I'm assuming they keep the VDI up to date, and I don't know if anybody checked. The VDI is running 2013. Okay, and that's absolutely fine, folks. So it's good. Thank you for checking for me. That was kind of my recollection. So I'll have to put in a support ticket with our tech support staff and ask them to update it, which they'll love because it's more work, right? But they'll do it. All right. Let's talk first about the language we're going to use. So, and just to make the clarification, because you guys, you're looking at a slide here that says Visual Basic, and I'm talking about Visual Studio. And the first distinction I'm going to make is Visual Studio is an authoring platform. It's what we call an integrated development environment. Now what that means in terms of writing computer code is it's an environment in which we have a text editor where we can type up our code, we can manage our files and the project resources. It has a debugger, a compiler, and a bunch of other tools that are built in that basically make the work a lot easier than it would be if we had a bunch of separate products to do it. And frankly, it's really the only way that you can effectively code in this language is to use Visual Studio. But Visual Basic itself is actually a language, so keep that in mind. Now, Visual Basic has its origins in a different computer language called BASIC. And BASIC as a computer language is one that mirrors the development of the personal computer. Both Apple PCs had BASIC as one of their original programming languages, and so did the PC side of things, the IBM world, and the Microsoft world. And for a long time, that language is not only used to develop software for those platforms, but was also used as the development language for the operating system on those platforms as well. And I think that's really kind of fascinating when you learn about this stuff and you learn that, wow, you mean Apples and PCs both started using with BASIC? Yeah, they both started with BASIC. And then when Macintosh was developed back in the early 80s, in 1984 it was released, Macintosh took a different route. They took their own branch of an operating system. But the Microsoft and the IBM PC world, they continued on that stream. And Windows, even as a platform, was developed using BASIC. And then eventually Visual Basic to start creating programs that have windows with little boxes where you can close them and drag the size of the window and move it around, all the stuff that we're used to now in a graphical environment. So Visual Basic has been the language of preference for Microsoft pretty much since the early foundations of that company. So really the last 30, 40 years, that's kind of been the primary development language. It's only been in about the last decade or so that Microsoft has actually switched their preference of development languages from Visual Basic to a language called C#. And now whenever you study anything from Microsoft officially, their primary language now is C#, which is a variant of the C programming language. But Visual Basic is still very heavily used out in the field, and you'll find that if you learn the one, it's really easy to learn the other because there's a lot of similarities. So that's a good thing. All right, some of this I already talked about here, but what's cool about Visual Basic, and one of my favorite teaching stories always, and I probably maybe even said this to you last week, is when I learned to code and we started developing windowed applications, I would first have to write the code to develop the window, and then I would write the program. You guys don't have to do that. The beauty of this is, if you want to put a window up on the screen, you're going to drag the shape of the window or adjust the size of the form that you're using. You want to put a button on that form, you just drag and drop it from the toolbar. Back in my day, right, as the adage goes, I had to write the code to make the button, and then I had to write the code to make the button do something. You guys will only have to visually drag and drop components, adjust their properties, and then apply code to them. So it really kind of accelerates the development process. So why do they have a language like Visual Basic? It's because it makes the work really quick. And people that write Windows applications, that's the primary way they will do it, is with a graphical tool. So just to give you an example, we're going to be creating stuff that looks a lot like this, right? You can see we have kind of the basic constructs of a window, including the shape. There's a title bar up at the top, the minimize, maximize, and close. And those are automatically generated by this product. And then you'll see stuff on the screen, where there's text, and then there's boxes in which you can type text, and then there's also little buttons at the bottom. And that's exactly the kind of stuff we're going to learn how to do here tonight as we move through the night. There's a procedure for creating a Visual Basic program. And what's interesting about that is when you're working in a GUI environment in particular, is that you'll start by actually creating your interface first. And then you'll write the code to make it do something. Now, if you've problem solved, in other words, if you've done your pseudocode and you've done your flow charts, the coding part's going to be actually pretty simple because you've already done the legwork there. And really the procedure that you guys should have for writing an application, and what I would say should come as a first bullet truly, is to do the problem solving part first. Pseudocode, flow chart. Then you would come in, create your interface. You'll figure out what things you need the program to do. So for example, if in our case with the fertilizer problem, we would probably put in a box for length of lawn, width of lawn, and then click the button, and it'll tell us how many gallons we need. That's what it'll look like. So we can kind of envision that already. Obviously, if it's going to tell us how many gallons we need, we also have to have a place for that to display. So we have to create that too, because you can make it do something, but if you can't see what it's doing, it's no good. All right, so you'll determine that user interface, and then you'll figure out which events it says the window should recognize. In our case, it should recognize that we type something into the boxes and that we hit the button. And then as a result of that, we will write some code based on the event of clicking on the button that will do something to actually do the math and show us what it's doing. All right. Now, thinking back a couple slides here, and it's one of the reasons I like to do my PowerPoints like this, because we can kind of keep this in mind as we're looking at this. What our procedure will be is kind of to figure out how to build those components. And you're going to see it's very simple. Because when you create a new project inside of Visual Studio, the first thing it'll do is it'll give you a little window already pre-built. It'll be empty, then you just have to put your stuff into it. So some of the stuff that we'll put into it is we'll put it in a text box, right? Well, what do you suppose that is? Maybe this little box here where we type text. And then you'll also put in text that tells you what to put in that text box, like here it says name or whatever. That would be a label. And I think you can probably guess as to what a button control is, right? That's the button. And you can see that all of those will have different attributes that will come with them. And once you get your hands on it, playing with it, that's where it gets really cool, and you'll see. But what's fun is that any of those components, I'll be able to go in there and click on them and resize them, make them bigger and smaller, and change the font size and color, and you can do all sorts of stuff. You don't have to get fancy with it. Sometimes a real basic interface is, honestly the best, because it just gets to the point, gets the work done. All right, back to the slide that we were working on. At this point, they're actually launching Visual Studio. So you know what? Let's launch Visual Studio. If you have it installed, go ahead and click the icon. It will take a moment to load up. And if it's the first time you're launching the software, there's kind of like that first use thing. And it might also ask you to sign in with your Microsoft account. Now, for those of you that are not aware, when Windows 8 came out, they kind of pushed that you use a Microsoft account. So when you sign into your PC, you use like an email address. And if you already have one of those, for example, you can use that to sign into the product. It's not a bad thing. I mean, they're giving you this like really expensive product for free, and all they're asking in return is that you sign in. That's a pretty small price to pay. So do that. If you don't, after a while, it will say that your license expired, and you either need to sign in or find a way to pay and provide a license key, which you don't want to do. So you just sign in. So it's free, right? If you don't have a Microsoft account, or if you're not a Windows user, the way that you create a Microsoft account is just like on the screens where they'll ask you for it, there'll be a spot where you can register for an account. But you can literally go to any Microsoft website, and I'll just pop out to one right now. Like, for example, like if you went to like Outlook.com, that would be one spot. And just create an account. Here's the cool thing about it. You don't have to create a new email account. You can use one that you already have, including your gateway email account if you want. It would work. Or some personal account. My recommendation would probably be to use a personal account in this situation, but I'll leave that up to you. And then once you have that Microsoft account created, that's the one you can use to sign in. Okay, so back to Visual Studio. When you do log in, you will see they'll have this, what they call the start page. And my general rule of thumb with the start page is I usually close it right away when I open the program, unless it just so happens that the thing I want to open is listed in the recent list, which isn't always the case. All right, so if you want to do that, go ahead and close that start page. But you're going to notice that this product it's not a small piece of software. The capabilities of this software are immense. And if you just start clicking through the menus, and I don't recommend like clicking on anything within the menus at this point, but just kind of like scroll through. And if you don't do this when you like encounter a new piece of software, you should. You go, wow, what is all that? What's an object browser? That kind of thing. Just look at the menus and see the kind of stuff that's available. And there's a lot going on, and chances are you might be a little bit bedazzled by all the options that are available. The options in the menu will change depending on the kind of project that you're working on and whether you actually have one open. So the product itself will have a default look. And in fact, maybe on the first launch, you got presented with a screen that says, choose the development environment that you want. And I'm not sure if that's the exact wording of it, but I'm going to actually try to recreate that screen here by doing this. You probably got a screen that looks like this, maybe, right? Maybe? Okay, maybe, maybe not. And it'll ask you, like, what kind of development are you doing? So, like, when I'm teaching my ASP.NET classes or my SharePoint classes, we choose web development as our, you know, our layout style. When we're doing Visual Basic development, you probably want to choose either Visual Basic or General. And all that does, folks, is it just has a different way of arranging all the stuff on the screen. That's all it means. So for example, if I wanted to jump into web development mode, I would make that selection and click Finish. Of course, that's not what we're doing in this class, but the point of me showing you this is that if you like take these windows that you see in here and all of a sudden you lose that and you're not sure how to get it back, one way you can get it back is to do what I'm about to do right now. So watch this real carefully. You would go to your Tools menu, Import Export Settings, and then you would choose Reset All Settings, and then I always just choose No here, and then you choose the mode that you want. In this case, we know we're going to work with Visual Basic, so I'm actually going to choose the Visual Basic option, and that what that will do is it will put a certain standard set of tools up on the screen in a certain type of a layout. And as you're working on different components, different things will pop up. Now, this is kind of interesting because this is an environment that if you were a professional developer, you would probably get to the point where you would use a layout that might be totally custom to the kind of work you're doing, even to the point of where you're taking some of the little extra boxes that appear on the screen and you pick them up and you move them to a second screen. And I often do that. And then you can actually save it and then pull it up. And, you know, so depending on, like, if I was working at home with my 3 monitors, I'd probably have a 3-monitor layout and I'd save it. Or if I was working on my laptop, I'd probably have a different one and I could save it. But you can always go back and reset it. Okay, so that's the kind of flexibility we're talking about here, where you can totally customize your workspace, save that setting, and bring it back at any point in time. All right, so that's kind of the basics of that little aspect of it. All right, on the next slide here, they're going to ask us to start a new project. So guess what we're going to do? Let's start a new project. So I'm going to come up to the File menu here. And notice I'm not doing this from the Start screen, and my preference usually is not to use the Start screen. I did say that, right? I usually close it, and then I go to the menus. And if I'm going to do a new Visual Basic project, I will say File, New Project, and then you're going to get a screen. Now, I will tell you, my screen will probably look different than yours because I've done all sorts of development on here and I have all sorts of different plugins. And for example, right now you can see, like, I'm dropped into like the SharePoint mode because one of the other things that I teach here is I teach in the SharePoint program, and there's all this custom type of development that we do there. What you guys are looking for, though, on the left-hand side of this menu here, notice how there's a templates and it's listed under installed. And notice that there's a Visual Basic option. Now on the slide, it wants us to choose New Project. And notice that how their menu looks a little bit different. Did anybody get a menu that looks like this when they were doing it? I can tell you why. This is a Visual Studio 2012 screen right here. Long story short, though, is you still end up in the same place. You still get this interface, and you will get that option, left-hand side, Visual Basic, and then the option that we want to choose is a Windows Forms application. So I'm going to go back to Visual Studio, and it just so happens that that's the top choice. Now, just as food for thought for people that maybe have some more advanced skills, they do have a search thing that's built in here. So if you were, let's say, like I was working on like the SharePoint stuff and it had SharePoint, and I just want a Visual Basic Forms application, I can actually do a search. I can just type in a term and it will automatically narrow down the choices. You see that? So if you're like looking at a screen, you're not sure how to get to where you're going, I just type forms it found Windows Form Application and Visual Basic. You guys are probably using it for the first time, so you can just click on Visual Basic here, which probably is already selected, right? And then choose Windows Form Application, and don't do anything yet, okay? Because some of the next clicks that we make are really critical.
So for me, 2017 just has Visual Studio Solutions and then
Okay, we took a little bit of a brief pause here in class because we have some students using their own equipment who opted to install 2017, which is one of the things I actually just recommended that you do. However, when they went to make the same choices to create a new project, they weren't finding the option for creating a Visual Basic Windows Forms application, which is kind of interesting that it wouldn't be included in the default install. So what we did is we did a little research online, and what we discovered is that when you do the installation of Visual Studio 2017, you want to make sure that you also select this component here, which is the .NET Desktop Development option, which makes sure that you have those components present. So you guys are going ahead and you're doing that and adding that component. So basically all you have to do is launch the installer within the program and make that selection, and it'll do the work for you, and then you can come back and catch up with us. All right. So back to Visual Studio. New project. Visual Basic, right up here at the top, and a Windows Form application. Going back to the slideshow, we're following what the author is doing at this point. And now notice he's just going to have you select that and click OK. And the point here is just to see how it works. Now when we actually get to building project, there's little nuances to all the little settings on the screens that will have an impact on how your project plays out. But for right now, we'll do exactly what the author is doing. So in this case, we're just going to leave the name as to what it's set, which is Windows Application 1, and I'm just going to click OK. Now what that does is the product goes through and it builds out the template for building a really basic windowed application. So you can see up on the screen, the things are divided into a few different sections. The big area of the screen, of course, you see that there's an object on the screen that looks like a window because that's what we're building. And this is what they call it. You know, developers call Windows within Windows a Windows form. So that's the kind of application that it is. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that we have an area called the Solution Explorer. And it sounds a lot like File Explorer or Windows Explorer, and it kind of sort of is. It's kind of a File Explorer, but not exactly. Because you can actually directly add files to this area and use it somewhat as a file manager, but it's not really a file manager. It really is an area that shows you the resources of the project that might include files, but often it includes objects that are within the form or other things like the code that's actually behind the form. Bottom right side of the screen there, you'll also see this thing called the Properties window. And the one thing that you're going to discover when you're working graphically is any object that you put on the screen is going to have properties attached to it. And that's one spot where you can adjust those properties. So for example, a property of this window right now is its size, right? And you can see that this window, if you look really carefully, is selected, and there's that little dotted line that goes all the way around it, and more importantly, these little handles, right? You see a handle at the bottom, handle on the right, handle in the bottom corner. And as you would anticipate, you can grab those handles and move and change things. Now, what I want you to notice is down in that Properties window, how I just changed the size of that window. And did you notice that the size here just changed? So I did something graphically on the screen, and then these numbers dynamically change. But you know what? If I knew I wanted the window a very specific size, I could actually type it in also. So that's something you should know. What we're going to build initially here is going to be pretty basic. So let's just leave that where it is right now. Back to the slideshow. Right, and he's kind of doing the same thing. He starts pointing out all the different aspects here. Now, the other thing that you should be aware of is, there's all these little pointers to the components, and I think I showed you some of these already, but notice that there's a toolbar right below the menu bar. That menu bar and what you see on that menu bar is always going to vary relative to whatever tool you're working on. So if I'm like clicking on the window, the toolbar will look one way. If I double click and go into a form, you'll notice that the toolbar changed to match the fact that I'm in a code window. Don't worry about following me right now. I'm just showing you kind of a concept here. There's also a toolbox that we're going to pull up, and that's kind of our next step here. The toolbox sometimes is visible and sometimes is not. By default, with the settings that we have, the toolbox is not visible. So what you guys really should be seeing on your screen right now is the form. And then if you look off to the left here, you'll notice that there's a toolbox that's sitting sideways, and you can click on it and expand it. And if you want to lock it into place, you can just hit this little push pin that's right here. It's the icon right next to the X, and you just click on it and it'll stay there. If for some reason you're not seeing the toolbox here on the side, you can still bring it up by just going to the View menu, and then notice right here, there's an option for toolbox. That will show it if it's not showing, whether it's sideways or normal, right? So if you ever lose your toolbox, or if you do that and see how it disappeared now because I clicked the X, just go back up to View and click Toolbox. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're actually going to start building that Fertilizer application. And if you think about what we needed to do, remember we had to get the width of the lawn and get the length of the lawn, right? So I'm thinking that the best way to do that is kind of like that example screen that we saw before, is to have some boxes where we can type that in. So guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to put some on the screen. Those boxes are called text boxes, and you can see in your toolbox there's going to be a section of the toolbox that's called Common Controls, and that's usually what pops up first when you open that toolbox. And text box is amongst those tools. So a few different ways you can actually put that up on the screen, and I'll show you a combination of them. One thing you can do is you can do what I just did right now, which is to click on the text box and see how it's highlighted, and then I just come on the screen, and you notice how my pointer changed to a little plus sign with a little box on it, and then I just click again, and it puts it on there. That's one way. Another way is I can come over here to the toolbox and just double click text box and put another one on there. Or I can grab one and drag and drop. And I think the book points out a fourth way. I'm not sure what that one is. Click, point, and drag. Well, that would be basically doing this. Frankly, the ones I use most often are either double click or drag and drop, but that's really up to you. Now, magic key in most computer programs, you guys know the Control Z? You guys know what that is? The undo? Yeah, it's a great button. So I'm going to Control Z the last two text boxes I put out there because I don't need them. But you notice when I put that second one in there, it kind of overlapped the first. I'm actually going to come up here, click on it, and just kind of drag it out of the way. In fact, I'm going to take the other one, I'm going to move it, I'm going to kind of line them up. And wait, did you notice what just happened? It's got automatic alignment tools built in. So as you're moving stuff around, it's pretty easy to kind of get things to line up. Now, this is one of those things, if you're like a real ADD person and you're like working on these programs, you might get in there and you're going to get really perfect about how everything looks, and that's fine. My ultimate goal here is that you get the programs to work more than you get them to look pretty. Although I have a couple of assignments where I do throw in, I think, extra points if you do make them look pretty, if you want. Okay. So I got two text boxes put in there. The other thing I'm going to put on the form is a button, because I'm going to want a button that's going to actually run the calculations after I type in the information. So there is an option for button here. So I'm just going to drag and drop it over and just going to drop it right on the form. All right. Next thing I'm going to do is, well, I might know what this program is for. Like I might know that I should type length here and width here. But you know what? The user doesn't know that from what I'm seeing on the screen. So what is a really good practice is to provide information about the fields that you want them to enter information into so they know what to do. And that's just really good user interface design. And the mechanism that we'll use at this point in time is a thing called a label. So I'm just going to grab a label and put one right next to the first text box. You notice the alignment things coming into play again? And then I'm going to grab one more, and I'm going to put it by the other one, and I'm going to get it to line up not only with the bottom of that box, but also with the edge of the top one. There we go. All right, now that we have this stuff up on the screen, we can actually start doing some things with it. Any of these objects, remember I said that we have this properties window, right? And I said anytime that you're working on any particular object, the properties here will be associated with whatever property or object you're working with on the screen. So for example, if I click on label, my first label, you'll notice that this is going to change. And what's kind of neat is you can kind of scroll through here, this list, and what's fun about this list is that it shows you all the different properties relative to this label object that I can adjust. And what's even cooler about this, once you start to wrap your mind around it, is any one of these properties I can set. But I can also, if I can set them manually, I can also set them programmatically, meaning I can write code to do it too. That's kind of cool. And you'll see the power of that as we step through the course. But for right now, a name like label 1 is not very useful to me. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to change that. Thing is, I can't really change that here because I double clicked it and I clicked it and it did something I totally didn't want it to do, so I'm closing it. I'm running away from that. All right. The only way I can change the text inside there is to actually click on the object and then come down here to the properties window to make that change. And what I'm looking for is a field called name. Now, you might not see your properties look just like mine. And the reason for that is it's got two different sort modes for the properties. And I opt for the alphabetical one because a lot of times I'm like, okay, I just need to change the font. Font is F, so I just scroll down to F and I find it. So like, see, like mine are alphabetical, and I go to font. But you guys are probably in this mode, which is the default mode. And what that does is it has things broken down into categories. So for example, it's got a design category and a focus and a layout and a size and yada, yada, yada. It's got all these different things that maybe I'm not even looking for. But if you were actually looking for changing the name, boy, I'm not seeing name pop up easily here. Are you? No, right? So that's why I often will opt to just switch to alphabetical mode because the name for the object is right up at the top. And I want you to watch what happens here. I'm going to call this, well, it's called label 1. I'm going to call it enter with. You know what's going to happen here? It's going to fail. And this is kind of an important lesson here. The name that I'm changing here is not the text that I see on the screen. That's kind of your first intuition, right? What I'm changing is the name of the object. It's not something the user sees. Truth is, I should just leave that alone. Label 1 is fine for right now. So whenever I want to control this object through my computer code, I will say label 1 and then do something with it. Yes? Okay, so yeah, you're kind of stealing my thunder a little bit. So you click on it, and then what you do, just start typing. But look where it's typing. Yeah, what's going on is you're actually in a different mode. And I'll get to that. So just hang tight. So the field we actually want to change for this, folks, is text. So if you click this little alphabetical button, scroll way down, and you'll see text at the bottom. You can then click in that box and make the adjustment. So I'm going to actually put in what I want the user to see, which is enter width of lawn in feet. And then you can see that text is so long, how it now it doesn't look good. So I'm actually going to grab that and then move it. You can do the same thing with the other one, may as well. Click on it first, and then come down here and type enter length of lawn in feet. And once again, I'm just going to move that, adjust it, align it. Now, in terms of designing a program, it's always a great idea to give people plenty of information so they know what to do on the screen, right? You don't want to be guessing. So that's why I like to be kind of verbose with that. Now, the button also has some text on it, and this one just says button 1. That's not very useful. How about we change the text on the button? Once again, I'm coming back to the properties window here, and I'm going to change it to calculate. That's a good one. Simple. And after I'm finished typing it, I just press enter or tab in the properties window, and it will change. So you can see the button now says calculate. Interestingly, as I work on this screen, and I'm working on my own personal laptop today, the display resolution of my screen is 1600 pixels by 900 pixels. That's how many pixels we have on the screen. For me, the text inside that window is a little bit small for my eyes, right? I don't know if you guys agree. Maybe you like it. Maybe you think it's fine. But I think the font could be bigger, right? So I'm going to go back and highlight this first label, and this time I'm going to scroll up and find font. And then one thing I want you to notice here is that first that I can make that bigger, which is good. But it's got all this stuff typed in, and I'm like, I don't have to manually type in the font and the size, do I? No. They're actually, if you click the little expander sign here, so you see that's plus sign next to font, you can actually come in and see each one of these things separately. So if you want to change what font it is, and you want to change the size, the thing that I'm concerned with, frankly, is the size. I'm probably going to make that like a 12, I think, is probably good. So I typed 12 and pressed enter. So you can see how it got bigger. I'm going to do the same thing for the other one. Change that to 12 too. I really don't mind the font. I think that font looks fine. Now this is overlapping again, so once again I'm moving my boxes. But you know what? These text boxes, they also have a font size. So if I'm changing that one to 12, I may as well change the other one to 12 too. So I'm going to click on the text box this time and then select size, switch it to 12. You can see the box got a little bit bigger. I'm going to click on this one, select the size, change that to 12. Now, heck, the button looks small now, doesn't it? Now we're getting picky. We're really not being that picky. But I will click the button, and once again, I'm going to change the font size of that, and I'm actually going to maybe make it bigger than 12. I might even go to 14. You notice that's certainly too big for that button, so I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to grab one of the little handles here and make it bigger and make it real obvious. You want somebody to click on your button? Make it an obvious button to click on. The other thing that would be very nice, frankly, is that maybe we should add another label, and I'm going to put this one up at the top, and then I'm going to change the text for that one to describe the program that I'm writing. So I'm going to call this Fertilizer Calculator. And that certainly, since it's a title, should be much larger. So once again, I'm going to scroll up on this list, find the font size, and I might take that even up to like maybe a 16. And I might switch right here. See how they have a bold? I might actually make that, instead of false, you can click a little box next to it and make it true. And if you want, you can even change the color. Now, they don't have font color as a listing, but they have this thing called for color. Maybe that's it. Now, the color interface here is a little bit weird. It's not the same kind of color interface that you're probably used to looking at. But the thing that I'll tell you is that it does have different palettes. So you see I clicked that for color, came over here to the side, but then notice up here across the top of this box how it's got custom, web, and frankly it doesn't matter which palette you pick from because the color will turn out to be whatever it is. I'll choose like a dark blue. That'll probably look nice. And folks, play with it to your heart's content. You want to make it look all fancy, that's great. Remember, my focus is that the stuff that you need is there and that it works. The other thing that we haven't done so far, what haven't we done so far? Yeah, well, that's true. We haven't made the button do anything. But we also have been working creating a program. We haven't saved this thing once. Right? If lightning struck or power went out, we'd lose all our work. So why don't we go ahead and come up to here and click on the Save button. Now when we do that, you'll notice that the form originally had a little asterisk on it here to indicate that we had made some sort of a change. And I'm going to make that asterisk come back by just moving this button. Because now we move the button, and notice right there the asterisk? It's an indicator that it's not saved. So go ahead and save it. One last thing that we're going to need to do is we're also going to need a place to put the output of the results of our calculations. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do a shortcut. You know what my shortcut is? Copy paste, right? You know what might be a good mechanism for doing this? What if I just have another label in another box, and one can say the answer is, and the box will hold the answer. Simple enough, right? But did you notice how I selected both of these things? I took my mouse and I did a click drag and drew a box around those two objects, and the two objects that are within my drag selection are now both highlighted. So if I copy, I do Control C, or right click copy if you prefer. And maybe I'll do that just because people watching video, that's better than hearing my voice say it. And then I'll do a paste, and it replicates those. Now, they are not the same object, so what I want to show you in this process is that I'll click on this, click off of there, and then click back onto the label, and then notice if I scroll to the properties list way up at the top, that the label's got its own unique name now. One thing that happens is when you're writing computer code, even though the objects look the same, they cannot have the same name. Every object on that form has got to have a unique identifier. The other very interesting thing is that identifier cannot contain spaces in its name. If you want to simulate a space, you can put an underscore or a dash, but it cannot contain spaces. That's why I got that error message before, by the way. All right, so I'm going to leave the label name there, but I am going to scroll back down to the text area, and I'm going to say number of gallons needed. And then I'm also going to click on this text box just once again to show you that that one came up with its own unique name as well. All right, now believe it or not, our interface design is complete. I have everything on that Windows form that I need to create my application. I put in a button to do the calculation. I put in 2 boxes where people can type in the length and the width. Gave them, primitive instructions on what they should do, right? And then a title too up at the top that's got a nice blue color to it. So that part of our work is complete. What you should do at this point is go ahead and click, instead of the save button, click the save button that's next to it, which is the 2 little diskettes, and that's save all. Now, for my money, when you're working on projects, that's the more useful button for save. Because what you're going to learn here is that when I create my form, that's one object. And when I hit the save button, the big icon, it just saves the form. If I've written any code to go with it, I would have to go save that separately for that to save. But if I hit the save all button, it will save everything. And if this is the first time you're clicking that save all button, you will get this interface, notice, that is the save project interface. So this is where we're going to have to do a little bit of new introductory material. So since this is a new project, we're not just saving the code and we're not just saving the form, we're saving everything. And all of it gets bundled together as a project. I'm going to name that project Fertilizer. You know what? And that's probably good. Fertilizer is fine. What I want you to do is not hastily click OK, though, because I want to point out a couple of other things here. The name of the project is one thing, but you notice 2 boxes down where it's got a thing that says solution name? That's actually a file that is it's kind of like a pointer file of sorts. It indicates to Microsoft Visual Studio all the resources that are contained in the project. So we will keep that typically matching the name of the project. And that's what I recommend. There's not really much of a reason to change that. Now, a couple of more things. Where are you putting your work? What I would suggest to you guys, and if you're not already in this habit, is that you should create yourself a folder somewhere on your hard drive that contains all the work for this class. I put all my stuff on my Google Drive, and I am running a memory resident version of Google Drive on my machine. So that it's actually, I have a regular file folder on my machine that is my Google Drive. I'll show you how to do that if you'd like to know. And inside there, I have a folder for this course. So I'm going to open that. And then I also created a folder for the 2017 summer semester for you guys. All right, so I'm going to go in there. That's where I'm going to save my project. So I'm going to click select folder once I'm inside the folder I want. And then we have a couple more boxes here to contend with. One is create directory for solution. And that is the default setting for Visual Studio. At this point in time, though, I want you guys to uncheck that. If you leave it checked and you already said, okay, it's really not that big a deal, it's not going to hurt anything. But my recommendation is early on when we're building these simple projects that you typically opt to deselect that. All that does is it takes that pointer file that tells you where all the resources are and it puts it into the same folder with all the other project resources. If I were to leave that checked, it actually creates a separate folder for the project and puts a separate folder for the solution file, and that can sometimes be problematic, especially in early stages of development. So my early recommendation is uncheck that, and then when you've got those settings made, just go ahead and click Save. It'll take a moment, and your work is all saved. Okay? Not just the form, but any of the code that maybe you tried to create as well. All right, one thing that we didn't do with our form, I thought our visual interface was done. We have another tweak to make. So far we've kind of been clicking on stuff that's inside the form, but one thing that you can also do is you can actually click on the form itself. So instead of clicking on anything there, I'm just going to click on like the title bar here. You can see how the handles switch back to like the outline of the form. Well, you know what? The form text, what it says up here, that's kind of ugly. It says Form 1. I don't want that on my form. I'm going to come down here and change that text too, so I can control what it says there. And I'll say Fertilizer Calculator. Or app, or whatever you want to call it. And then you can see it changed up here in the window. Once again, I'm going to hit the Save All button. All right. Our next step now is to get to the coding. But before we get to the coding, I'm going to kind of jump us back over to the PowerPoint for a minute and just kind of look at some of the things that we've been doing and see if some of this stuff looks familiar as I kind of like walk through these slides. All right, so we learned about the toolbox, right? We learned how to get stuff out of the toolbox, double click, drag and drop. Those are my two favorites, but you can use these other two approaches as well. You'll find stuff, frankly, you'll find the way that works best for you, and that's what you'll go with. We learned how to put the stuff onto the form itself. Oh, one thing that we didn't do is this slide. Notice how the text box has this little box with an arrow on it. That's known as the task button. So we haven't played with that yet, but that gives you the capability to tweak certain things that are relative to that object. You'll see that as we go. But that's the name of it. I mean, if you want to play with it now, you could click on the text box and then just come up here and click on that little box. And you can see that depending on the kind of object you're working with, it'll give you a bunch of different options here. And when we get to the point of working with databases, where we start to connect this up to a database, you'll see that you'll have a much more robust list of options. Okay? And it's all relative to whatever object is on the screen. Right now, we're just working with text. And right now, I don't need it to be multi-line because we're just going to type in one number, right? But you could anticipate that if I click that little box that said multi-line, that would allow me to type in a line and another line and another line and fill it out that way. Learn about the properties window, right? We learned that you can sort two different ways. My preference usually is the alphabetical, but either one you can find the same stuff. Shows you how to work with it. And I think you guys have kind of already figured that out. Properties that you can change. We played with that too. How do you change your properties? Well, typically when you change the properties, you just go in there, find the one that you want to change, and then click on it. What's kind of interesting about that, and one's just popping into my head, but the number of gallons needed, right now if I ran this program, the user would be able to type something into that box. But that's where we want to put the answer, right? So a real good setting for that text box is actually to come over here to the properties window and find the option that says read only and switch it from false to true. So what that's going to do is the user will not be able to accidentally type in that box. Isn't that cool? And you probably have seen forms like that, right? I would type in this box if I could, damn it. Right? Well, that's what they do to you. All they're doing is they're flipping a property and they're setting it so you can't do it. You guys played with changing the color a little bit? Did you do that? Playing with the fonts? And yes, you can bring up the whole font interface if you really want to get fancy with it. We also learned how to change the text on the button. So we did accomplish a lot of stuff here. One thing we didn't put on here is an access key, but you know what? I'm going to save that for a little bit. We don't have to do that right now. We did play with the label control. That's the one that's just the text. We did not learn about the list box. I'm going to do that later, and that's for a good reason. And here's the other thing that I was talking about was the name property. So as we start transitioning now from creating the visual interface to actually creating the code that's going to make it do something, we're going to start worrying about this stuff. But before we do that, let's jump back over to Visual Studio. And this is kind of fun. If you haven't saved your work, go ahead and click the Save All button. And guess what we're going to do next? We're going to run our program. Ooh. It's so exciting, right? Especially if you've never done this before. And this is really fun. You know how you do it? There's a button here that says Start. Now, I'm going to explain to you first what that does. What that does is it takes whatever we've built so far and it runs it through a compiler. We haven't really had that formal talk yet either. But a compiler is what's going to take our computer code and turn it into something that the machine understands what to do with. So usually that means it takes it from like these images and graphics that we're creating here and the code that we've put together and converts it into ones and zeros that the machine can execute. So if you want, go ahead and click that button. It'll take a second. And look what happened. That's pretty exciting. It created a window with all the stuff that we put in it. It also is running a couple of tools here in the background. It's showing me how much memory is actively being consumed by the application. That's kind of a cool little window. It's not really too useful right now because we're not doing anything hardcore processing, but if we were running a big application, it would show us basically how efficient our program is operating. So now I can type stuff into these boxes even just as it is, right? This one we set to read only. I can't type in it. I can even click on my button. What the heck? It's not working. Right, because I didn't tell it to do anything. All right, you want to play with the other controls? You can minimize. You can maximize. Whoa. And you can close it. All right? Now, if you had some sort of a problem with your program, if you put something together in a way that didn't make sense to the program, when you hit that Start button, there's a box that will appear at the bottom of your screen. It'll start to throw error messages, and it'll tell you what's wrong and that you need to fix it. And very often, that will prevent you from running the program if it's broken. All right, before we get into the point of actually writing the code, which is our next step, we're going to take a break. I'm going to terminate the video that I've got running now, and we'll start a fresh one, and we'll do the coding part. All right? So let's take this is our halfway break, so let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll see you in the next video.